Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're unpacking a fascinating and intensely debated historical mystery. We're going to look closely at a specific source's breakdown of a really common claim regarding the origins of the Quran. We'll be neutrally analyzing exactly how the source material investigates this, presenting their arguments and the textual evidence step by step.
So, let's dive right into the core of this. It's a widespread claim that you hear quite a bit, the idea that the Prophet Muhammad simply copied the Quran from previous Judeo-Christian texts. But, interestingly enough, the source we're looking at today argues that when you actually break down the historical and textual evidence, it proves the exact opposite.
The source tackles this through a three-part investigation. First, Axis 1, the means, then Axis 2, the environment, and finally, Axis 3, the content.
Starting off with Axis 1, the impossibility of means. We're examining the logistical barriers here.
We really have to ask the practical question. Could an individual in 7th century Mecca physically copy these complex biblical manuscripts? The source looks at the raw logistics, and it's pretty wild. Historical records state that at the dawn of Islam, only 17 men in all of Mecca knew how to write. Think about that. Illiteracy wasn't some personal flaw or a secret to be hidden, it was just the standard baseline for the entire society.
And to give you a bit more context, the source cites scholars pointing out that even among Jews in Palestine centuries earlier, people who actually had a written scripture and a scholarly tradition, literacy was only sitting around 3%. So an unlettered or illiterate prophet wasn't an anomaly at all. It was absolutely the norm for that era and that region.
Plus, even if someone could read, what exactly would they read? The source notes that the Bible wasn't even translated into Arabic until centuries after the Quran was revealed. The earliest unconfirmed translations popped up in the 8th century, and the official Arabic Torah didn't appear until the 10th century, meaning back in the 7th century, there was literally no Arabic text available to copy from.
Now, what about the idea of secret teachers? The source systematically debunks this too. People often point to figures like Waraka bin Nofal, Bahira the monk, or a Roman blacksmith. But the source argues these encounters are highly problematic for the copying theory. The meeting with Waraka was incredibly brief before he passed away. The encounter with Bahira, that lasted only a few hours when the prophet was just 12 years old. And the Roman blacksmith was a marginalized figure with very limited knowledge, definitely not a master of complex theology.
Let's move to Axis 2, the Meccan environment. This is a cultural backdrop lacking Judeo-Christian influence.
So, was this deep biblical knowledge just floating around in the local culture, ready to be absorbed by anyone? Well, the Meccans literally asked, "Has he made the gods only one God? Indeed, this is a curious thing." The source explains that Meccan society was entirely pagan. They were deeply shocked by the very concept of monotheism, let alone having any familiarity with the intricate histories of biblical prophets.
Furthermore, the analysis points out that the Quran explicitly reminded the Meccans that detailed stories of figures like Noah, Joseph, and Mary were the unseen, or Ghaib in Arabic. The text boldly announces that neither the prophet nor his people knew these stories beforehand. The source argues this proves there was absolutely no local Judeo-Christian scholarly community in Mecca to learn these profound historical details from.
And that brings us to Axis 3, the contrasting content. Let's do a forensic textual comparison. The source posits a really simple logical rule. If the Quran was copied from the Bible, the narrative details should be virtually identical, right? So let's look at the story of Joseph. The biblical account refers to the ruler of Egypt as Pharaoh, but the Quran consistently refers to the ruler during Joseph's era as a king, reserving the title Pharaoh only for the ruler in Moses' time. The source highlights that, historically, Egypt was under the rule of the foreign Hyksos dynasty during Joseph's time, making king the historically accurate term. If it was just a copy, it would have repeated the historical error.
Here's another striking difference. The source points out a narrative flaw in the biblical account of Joseph. In the Bible, Joseph's famous dream involves his parents and brothers bowing to him, but it also states his mother, Rachel, died long before the family ever reunited in Egypt, which makes the dream's fulfillment logically impossible. The Quran, on the other hand, maintains perfect logical consistency by stating that both parents entered Egypt and bowed to Joseph.
The Quran also adds some serious psychological realism to the narrative. In the Bible, Jacob simply sends his beloved son Joseph off to his brothers, who he knows hate him, without any fear or hesitation. The source argues this is a massive gap in human behavior.
The Quran fills this gap by showing Jacob expressing deep psychological fear and reluctance, specifically worrying that a wolf might eat Joseph. It completely transforms the psychological depth of the story.
We also see stark theological differences. In the biblical account, Joseph uses his special cup for divination, essentially reading omens, which is a pagan practice. The Quran recounts the exact same story of the cup being placed in his brother's bag, but explicitly removes the divination aspect. It's simply a standard drinking vessel. The source notes that this intentionally purifies the prophet's character from pagan practices.
So the crucial takeaway here is a major thematic shift across the board. The source highlights that the Bible contains accounts of major prophets committing terrible sins, like idolatry or worse, but instead of copying these accounts, the Quran consistently elevates and protects their moral standing. In the Quranic narrative, prophets are honored, infallible, and protected from such major sins, serving as perfect, pure role models.
Finally, the conclusion, the unity of source. One divine origin, not human copying.
Let's pull all of this together. The source argues that when you combine the logistical impossibilities, the cultural vacuum of Mecca, and these highly specific textual corrections, the plagiarism theory completely shatters. It leads to a much more profound conclusion. The explainer concludes that the broader similarities between these texts exist due to what's called the unity of source. This is the theological concept that similarities exist because they share the same original divine origin, not because they were blindly copied from one another. Essentially, the source sees the Quran acting as a divine filter, correcting human alterations and restoring the original narratives.
To show the real-world impact of this analysis, the source shares a pretty powerful anecdote. The speaker mentions a man he knew who actually embraced the faith precisely because of the content of this exact claim. When the man realized that an unlettered person in the 7th century desert couldn't possibly have masterminded these intricate historical, psychological, and theological corrections, he saw it as proof of divine origin rather than human plagiarism.
We'll leave you with this provocative thought from the source's investigation. If the text was simply copied, why does it consistently correct, elevate, and fix the narrative rather than just repeat it? If it was a mere copy, how did it become such a meticulous historical and theological upgrade? It's a fascinating question, and it really makes you rethink the historical origins of these monumental texts. Thanks for joining us on this explainer, and keep learning.